lessons in health, education, and prosperity for the rest of the India. Over to the moderator, Dr. Meena Rajesh, madam.
Yeah, good evening. We have this book called South versus North, and why South is being very successful in three major areas. That's the book which Nilakant has written about. So my first question to you, Nilakant, would be, what made you to write this book, first of all? And how did you approach writing this book? Because it talks about a lot of facts and figures. I have read your book. It talks about many facts and figures. So how did you approach while writing the book? So 2 questions.
Is this working? Now it should work? All right, cool. So to answer your first question first, my day job is that of a data scientist. So I calculate probabilities for a living, right? So in 2011, my home state of Tamil Nadu had assembly elections, right? And I was living in Madras at that time. And what does a reasonable data scientist who happens to have an election in, his home state do? What he does is he calculates the probability of his vote actually impacting the elections, right? So I did that, right? Like, what is the probability that my vote would actually result in changing the outcome of the election in my constituency? Yeah. So I did that for my MLA. And then, it was an absurdly low number, as you can imagine. I just thought, the society as such should be told to vote in large numbers, to the individual, it makes no sense to go and vote, right? Because it's a meaninglessly small number, right? So that. But I got curious and I calculated what is the equivalent probability for my parliamentary constituency, which happens to be South Madras, right? Now, when I calculated the, that probability, it again was significantly small. If I'm not wrong, it's about e to the power minus 342. Like that is, I'm talking about like circa 2011, right? Out of curiosity, again, what I did was I took like a random constituency from middle and northern India. I happened to take this constituency called Guna, which happens to be in Madhya Pradesh. And I found out that the probability of the average voters vote in Guna impacting their elections, small as both South Madras and Guna are, the probability of the voter in Guna is about 40% lower. In other words, the voter in South Madras is 40% more powerful than the voter in Guna, right? This was 2011, 12. Anyway, so I just got really, really curious as to why this difference exists, right? Like, after all, what is a democracy? A democracy is one person, one vote, in which we want every voter's vote to count equally, right? And when this sort of number stared at me, I got really curious and started digging. Why is it that, there is this extreme divergence between sort of these two sets of states and these two sets of constituencies in the same country, which in effectively the same election, right? That journey of a decade is what resulted in this book about 10 years later in 2022. Right. So to answer your question, how did I write this book? Going into rabbit holes is how I wrote this book.
Okay. On a lighter note, I felt while reading, I thought MK Stalin asked you to write this because it was propagating anti-Modi scheme a lot. I'll come back to you on that. So while writing this book, how did you manage to collect so much of data? Like, were you in the field, or was it based on the data available on the various secondary sources?
Again, I work as a data scientist for what is a large corporation. I do not have the time to go, and there's no way in which I'm anyway going to collect better data than the various state governments and the government of India have put out, right? Like, all my data is government data.
Okay. So his book, South versus North, talks about, it's divided in 3 parts. And the first part says that South India does well in health, education, and in business, economy, specifically. So when I talk about health, you have done a good amount of research and people knew it, that the health infrastructure in South is far better than what's there in the North. So my question is, number one, why so? And number two, what the rest of North India should learn from the southern states?
So this goes back to basic metrics, right? When you say the health infrastructure is better, for instance, people in this room, essentially upper middle class people who of means who come to lit fests, right? Like the health infrastructure to you means a private hospital, right? Like that is not how we measure the health of a developing society like us, right? Like how do you measure what is a healthy society in a developing country like ours, where pockets of it are still as bad as sub-Saharan Africa? That is the question to ask, right? And when you look at the literature, what you find out is there is one metric which is essentially experts around the world agree that it is the best metric for the following reasons. 1, it is easy to measure. 2, it is difficult to fudge. 3, it is not discriminatory between the rich and the poor, right? And that metric is infant mortality rate, right? And the reason why that is because children die of, and tragically so, die of very, basic diseases like diarrhea, right? Like these essentially a society that has extremely high IM, like 1 or 2 in 1,000 might die of real complicated diseases, right? Like, but for the most part, children in developing countries die of very preventable diseases which can be prevented with basic healthcare. Yeah. Now, what does that mean? It means that, and second, more important thing, it doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor. If your child is sick and dying, you will go seek healthcare, right? So the healthcare seeking behavior is also not discriminatory, right? And the kinds of and what do these two things put together tell you? It means that if a basic sort of a healthcare system is available to you, which is why I want to say, people in this room do not go to a primary health center, but imagine yourself to be a poor person in a rural area which is cut off from the cities, right? Like if the IMR in a state is low, what does it mean? It means that primary health center in a far-flung village which is remote is able to serve the sort of parents and the infants in that particular village. Yeah. And the prevalence of that and the ability of sort of doctors to serve in that primary health centers, because it is not as if, Uttar Pradesh doesn't have these primary health centers. It is that Uttar Pradesh's primary health centers are not peopled by sufficient doctors. If there are doctors, there aren't enough medicines. If there are medicines, there aren't enough cold storage, units in order to, store those medicines, so on and so forth, right? It's an entire government action in the supply chain of that particular thing, yeah? And because it is representative, right? And nobody in this world wants to see an infant die, right? And therefore, it is a normative idea that way. And therefore, when you look at the infant mortality rate of sort of children across the various states, you essentially look at what is the state of Kerala, which happens to have an infant mortality rate that is better than the United States of America. And you see the state of Madhya Pradesh, for instance, which has an infant mortality rate that is as bad as Afghanistan. Yeah. And this is the problem in a nutshell in healthcare, which is that we have a country wherein the sort of input parameters that go into the making of the healthcare system is so diverse that we have outcomes which are as diverse as the United States and Afghanistan. Yeah. And that is, to answer your question, why is it so? It is so because, these societies for a long time have had a certain agitational politics on the street, which have resulted in like a series of actions on the, on the ground, which include, in Tamil Nadu's case, for instance, reservations, right? Like it's a much maligned subject, but why? How is it that Tamil Nadu happened to sort of pool or people the primary health center with actual doctors? Because for like 30 years now or more than that, it has had a system wherein it incentivized doctors, saying that if you serve in a rural area after your MBBS, you would be given preferential treatment in your postgraduate studies. Yeah, so there's an incentive to doctors to go and serve. Second, the Jayalalitha administration in the early 90s started some of these are actually probably dystopian in that they essentially had an entire government bureaucracy of government nurses going into every village. They would have a giant register. If you ever happen to sort of visit Tamil Nadu, I encourage you to go look at the registers of these nurses from primary health centers, which is that every time a new woman comes into a village, they would write her name, and then they would say who's, did she marry and come in, or did she, come in by herself, whatever. And they would have every woman of reproductive age in that register. Sometimes they would go to the depths of basically, tracking her menstrual cycle, right? And it is problematic. But the point is that they used that to track, her reproductive health. They gave her sort of tetanus injections. They gave her, pills so that iron supplements so that she didn't have anemia, so on and so forth. And then the Jayalalitha government sort of, made these nurses, like they had an incentive program where they had a rolling shield. These nurses were given gold chains, gold coins, things of that nature, right? Like at the level of these women sort of got up, come meet the chief minister, get these gold coins and gold chains from her, things of this nature, which essentially resulted in there being a virtuous cycle of policy. Yeah. Now, you and I can sit here and sort of think that, oh my God, tracking the menstrual cycle of a woman, what a breach of privacy. But hey, look at IMR, right?
Yeah, that's really, I never knew about it. Fine. So it's another question that comes to my mind is, if a state is doing well economically, is it health infrastructure good enough, or is it vice versa? Like if the health infrastructure is good, then the state does well economically. How is it goes?
That is a sort of, so this is, like if you did not know anything about the health indices of states in India or anywhere in the world, you would imagine that relatively prosperous societies have relatively better outcomes in health, right? Like that's common sense. It's true to the most part in India, except, right? Take the state of Haryana. It's a relatively prosperous state, but it has very poor IMR, right? In fact, Bihar does better, right? So the point is that there are exceptions on either end of the spectrum, right? Madhya Pradesh is just an outlier. Like if you compare Madhya Pradesh to Bihar, Madhya Pradesh is relatively more prosperous than Bihar, though Madhya Pradesh is poor by standards of other states, but it's richer compared to Bihar. But Madhya Pradesh does far worse compared to Bihar, right? And so there are exceptions both ends of the spectrum, right? Kerala is not Kerala is prosperous, but it's not the richest state by any stretch of imagination, right? But it is the best state by like a mile, right? Like Kerala's IMR, for instance, is 5. The United States of America's IMR is 6, right? So it's a remarkable success story, right? Like the state of Maharashtra, for instance, does quite well. And it is a prosperous state. As you would expect, it is doing as much as its relative wealth sort of, you would expect Maharashtra to do well, it does well, right? But Gujarat, for instance, doesn't do well, right? Like there are very many states which sort of do not follow this norm. But in general, across all states, it's true that relative increase in prosperity results in relative increases in health outcomes. However, Southern India does better if you do a regression analysis relative to their levels of prosperity.
Okay. So when we talk about the second pillar, education, when I went through your book, like you were totally against introduction of NEP, as the South actually boycotts NEP in totality, and you are totally against NEET also. Like you feel that is it's a politically motivated decision of introducing NEET exam. So, and also the southern states are, the government is trying to abolish NEET in their respective states, Tamil Nadu and Karnataka. So, what is your take in that? Because as a layman, I feel that a candidate should be encouraged if on a merit basis. Like, if they could crack an entrance exam on their merit and they deserve a seat, instead of paying a hefty amount of donation, because almost all the politicians in the South own a medical college. So, now that's cutting short their backdoor, income. So what is your say on that?
That is a standard issue middle class response, right? And as a card carrying member of that class, I wrote my share of entrance exams in my youth, right? The problem is that world over, standardized tests are not a good way to measure what is the standardized tests do not have the predictive power in terms of figuring out who is going to do well in the course for which the student actually goes on and enrolls, right? This is not just true for India, it's true for the United States, it's true for Europe, it's true for Australia, it is true even in countries in Africa where this data is available, right? The point is that in our a certain middle class idea of quote unquote merit, we forget what the educational institution is there for. It is not the educational institution does not exist to sort students and at the gate. The educational institution exists in order to educate the people who are in, right? Like regardless of who comes in, right? And whom do you let in to be educated is the actual question. Yeah. Now take the case of NEET. What does this NEET do? Tamil Nadu, like I just said, one of the incentives is that it has 69% reservation in this complicated system where it improves the health outcomes of obscure rural places. The second thing is and Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, for instance, have the highest number of per capita hospital beds, right? In secondary care, in tertiary care, so on and so forth, right? Like medical colleges happen to be one of the primary sources of tertiary care beds, yeah? Now, and they also produce the maximum number of doctors in those particular tertiary care hospitals, right? Now, the question then becomes, if you essentially have a sort of centralized idea of how to conduct this exam, what kind of students to let in, and also sometimes control the funding thereof because there are downstream consequences, you essentially change the ability of the state to sort of implement its health priorities, right? Now, India as a whole lags far behind Tamil Nadu and Kerala and Karnataka for that matter in terms of its healthcare outcomes. Why is India sort of teaching these states, which are much better off than the rest of the country, how to run its healthcare? It's a rather idiotic idea, right? Like, if anything, the rest of the states should follow the states that are successful, not vice versa. Yeah. Now, NEET exactly does that, right? And therein lies the problem, because it's what is the purpose of a healthcare education system? It is better outcomes in health for that particular society, right? If you were to use that yardstick, then the rest of the country needs to follow these states, and that is sort of common sense.
What about the midday meal scheme in the schools? So that has been a huge success in South, bringing in the students to the schools, government schools. So, and that has been replicated across India.
Right. So the midday meal scheme, like I argue in the book, is probably one of India's greatest success stories, right? And this success story was originated in Tamil Nadu and spread to other southern states. Let's come to, it has not been replicated elsewhere with the same degree of success, right? But you need to understand how the midday meal scheme originated in order to understand its success, right? After the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms in the 1920s, what was then the Justice Party, which is a predecessor of the current day DMK, right, was in the Madras Corporation was governed by the Justice Party, and they sort of introduced this idea of some version of this midday meal scheme in 1923, right, under the colonial administration. The colonial administration then in 24-25 sort of stopped the budgetary support for that, and therefore that program died a death. The second iteration of it happened in 1959 under the Kamaraj administration in Tamil Nadu, right? The problem then was that it had a very different design, and because you need to understand, India was and is still, but India was quite poor at that time, and therefore the state did not have sufficient resources. So Kamaraj basically said it will be the money for this would be equally shared between the local body and the state government, right? And it was essentially restricted to rural schools. Because of this complex financial burden, what happened was the implementation of it was uneven, because of which you essentially saw no difference in the gross enrollment ratio, that is the number of children who are going to school in Tamil Nadu in the time of during that Kamaraj version of the midday meal scheme, right? And you need to understand something. The Tamil Nadu kind of miracle is largely because of the midday meal scheme. if you were to sort of compare Tamil Nadu with, let's say, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, not Bihar, but Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, some of these states which we now consider as part of the Bimaru club, Tamil Nadu is, indistinguishable, right? It roughly had the same metrics, right? Kerala was always doing quite well. Andhra Pradesh, again, was indistinguishable. Karnataka was slightly better, but not that much better, yeah? But what happened in 1982 was that the M.G. Ramachandran administration, what it did was it redesigned, relaunched this same midday meal scheme, and the state government took the entire financial burden on itself. Yeah. And when it did that, it also set up like a entire state bureaucracy to monitor the implementation of this particular scheme. What you saw was just phenomenal. What happened was the gender gap in terms of gross enrollment ratio just vanished. Right? Because what happened was that girls started going to school, not because, their parents were suddenly interested in education, but they did not want the burden of feeding the girl child. And so they just sent them off to school, right? What you see from that point on is a remarkable success story, right? Like there are more girls in school, which then means that over time, there are more girls in colleges. And if there are more girls in colleges, what you then see is the female labor force participation later on, a generation later, increases. And what do we see today? 44% of all women who are employed in manufacturing in all of India happen to be in Tamil Nadu. And this state is like, 6-7% of the population. Yeah. And that is the success rate. What is the difference primarily between Tamil Nadu or Kerala for that matter, and to a lesser extent Karnataka and other states is the female labor force participation rate, right? Like if you have half of your sort of population not involved in activities which count towards the GDP, of course your GDP is going to suffer, yeah? And the way you solve this is to just make sure that there isn't a gender gap in the enrollment ratio, right? And you start it at primary school level, right? And that is how you sort of build a pipeline, yeah? And when you build this pipeline, again, a very important idea here is that, and this is one of the reasons why I oppose the National Education Policy or NEP, which is its idea is to test students again and again and again, right? That is the problem, right? Now, if you have a situation wherein you test a child in class 5 or class 8, right? We know that in class 8, the biggest reason for dropout from school is failure, right? Now, what would you rather have? Would you rather have the child stay in school despite the child failing? Or would you rather have that child drop out and go join like an informal job market? I think as a responsible society, it's our job to keep children in school, regardless of how they do in school. That we want to improve their outcomes is an important secondary idea. But the first idea is to keep the child in school, right? And that is the reason why I find this idea of testing antithetical to our idea of sort of our responsibility towards children, right? And entrance exam is an extreme version of that, right? Like, so we want to, if we want to have children in school, and the more number of children stay in school, the greater number of them graduate or learn something, right? Which is slightly better than nothing. And hopefully they go and become productive citizens. And that is the reason why the gross enrollment ratio of Tamil Nadu for both boys and girls and Kerala as well has just kept up and up and up. And right now, and to come back to your idea of why do I dislike the NEP, which is that the National Education Policy sets a target of 50%, right? 50% gross enrollment ratio in higher education, which is colleges, for the year 2035, right? When I wrote this book, I took 2020 data. And the gross enrollment ratio for the state of Tamil Nadu in 2020 was 53%. Now, what does the union government want? Wait until everybody catches up? Like, you're running a race, suddenly you want to stop the guy who's like running, first and have everybody else catch up and then start running again? It's an absurd idea, right? That is what the National Education Policy is, right? In a divergent country, what you want to do is You essentially want states to have policies which cater to their students and their population. That is why we elect a state government, right? Because the state government can then implement policies which are in our interest. If you have a national policy wherein you want to sort of, have the states of Bihar and Kerala have the same policy where Bihar's female labor force participation is under 5%. Kerala's female labor force participation is like upwards of 60%. Like, it doesn't matter how clever you are. It doesn't matter how well-intentioned you are. It doesn't matter how good a government you have in Delhi. Nobody sitting in Delhi will be able to have a single policy for these two sets of states. And that is the problem.
Fine. I disagree with you in certain points. One, see, you people, like, sorry to be more this thing, the southern states doesn't accept Hindi, okay? Because they are ready to learn Japanese and German and get into Germany and Japan, but they don't want to learn Hindi, which could make our life easier within our country.
Whose life?
People working, like, who wants to cross the border and work.
Let them learn. No? So here is the difference, right? If I want to learn Hindi or Swahili or Japanese, I will go and learn. For the same reason that, I don't know, people in Maharashtra probably learn Marathi first and then learn whatever language they want, right? Like, nobody is stopping them from learning Hindi. It is the idea of imposition of Hindi that governments in Tamil Nadu and the Dravidian movement in particular has sort of, fought against for since 1937, which is whatever, how many ever years that is, right? Now, there's a difference between saying that I do not want, like, you can't say, in order to integrate with me, you learn my language. That's an absurd idea, right? Now, which is very different from saying, hey, you learn whatever language you want, and we have like a common union, and, the union is sort of, a legacy of colonialism, and therefore, to communicate with the two of us, we will have the colonial language. Yeah, sure. Or if you want to have like a third language, I don't know, pick Python or Java, I don't care. But why is it that I have to learn your language to communicate with you? It's an absurd idea. Why don't you learn my language to communicate with me?
See, probably, let me take an example. In a family, there are two sons, and one being highly qualified, doing well in life, and the younger one is not doing pretty well. Whom do you think should be more proactive to help the undeserved person to come up?
A country is not a family. It's made of individuals. Individuals have rights. That is the fundamental.
But we are made
that is the fundamental.
We are union of states.
We are, and that is the fundamental disagreement that I have. A country is unlike a family, and individual citizens in a country have individual rights. What you're doing by saying that you better learn my language is you're violating that person's rights. Whereas in a family, you can basically say, do this because it's my roof. A country is not anybody's roof.
Again, I disagree here. Fine. Because being a Tamilian, if I didn't learn Hindi, probably I wouldn't have got a chance to be here sitting in front of you. And
I don't speak Hindi. I'm here.
You might be 1 in 1 million. Yeah, we'll have the questions. Basically, yes, sir. Yeah, please. Yeah. Yeah.
Idea is good. I don't deny it. But thing is, what about IIT entrance examinations?
Yeah.
National colleges?
Yes.
This kind of NEET examination should be for AIMS, All India Institute of Medical Sciences. Those kind of colleges to be constructed entirely in Hindi, so that the quality AIMS medical college is far better than others. That way it should be there. See, any point, it has to be addressed by another counter argument or point. Already that state has developed so many medical colleges. You asked one question. Everybody have that.
Can we come back to this later?
Okay, fine. Constructed a college for giving education. If they have not constructed any other industrial or anything to giving education, people are knowledge. That is why that colleges has come up. So number of doctors are more compared to other states.
Yes, sir.
If you conduct the NEET, please conduct the NEET one. Earlier it was like that only, JIPMER, AIMS and all.
Yeah.
Now so many, is Raisoni also the engineering college is there? Is it JEE part required for the Raisoni? No. State examination is okay.
Yes, but any one entrance exam is a must.
Yeah, that is there. That can be done. So that is the child. If you are filtering at the younger stage itself, it cannot come up.
Okay.
Right. I request Mr.
Yeah,
Nilakantan to continue with this.
Yep.
Yes.
We'll come to this in a little
Yes,
bit.
we will
Yeah,
come to this.
we'll surely discuss. In his book, like you have stressed upon two major points. One is decentralization, and decentralization in sense that you don't want anything to be forced upon by one power sitting in Delhi. You should do that. So, and nothing should be standardized. So, what is your take on that? See, overall, when we talk about standardization in any industry, that is going to improve the overall quality of that particular country or a product, wherever the standardization is introduced. So, the southern states being so powerful in all the three verticals are quite good, like, education, you're doing good in health and good in business. So, why to say no to standardization and no to centralization? Like, you have to be decentralized.
Because the reason why they have achieved this in the first place is because of state level policy. If you essentially agree to standardization, what you're doing is giving up that ability to set policy at the state level. What you do is, if you agree to standardization, essentially you're making what is an elected state government the equivalent of a glorified bureaucracy which follows orders from Delhi. Why would you do that? The reason why we elect governments at the state level, take the state of Maharashtra, for instance, right? Like, this would probably be what, 8th or 9th most populous country if it were a country by itself, right? Now, the people of Maharashtra have elected a state government to basically then say that, and why do people of the state elect a state government? It is to sort of enact policies which are proxies for their moral choices as citizens. That is why we elect governments in a democracy, right? Now, if you're essentially saying that these kinds of state governments, wherein these states are bigger than most European countries and most countries for that matter, like, elect their governments, but those governments are then subsumed by this union government with such policy in Delhi, and they are there only to implement it. It is a sort of violation of the basic tenet of self-government, which is what democracy is supposed to be, right? Like, what is democracy? You elect a government to sort of impart your choices at your society level. As the layers of government go farther and farther away from you, you want that government to have lesser and lesser effect on your life, right? Now, it's the reason why we don't have a world government, right? Now, to argue that a country of 1.4 billion people, with divergences as much as the United States and Afghanistan, as we have just seen, should have a single union government with a single policy which basically dictates all of us is, A, unviable, B, insulting to the political dignity of people.
Okay. Coming back to the mid half of the book, after seeing the success stories, reading about the success stories of southern states in health, education, and business, like, he's against the GST also, so not touching much upon that. There is a column that you have written, the section column called Wicked Problem. Now, again, I thought that problem maybe you are stating down the problem that the north states are facing, but then he talks about two major problems that the southern states are facing. Interestingly, he calls it as a wicked, like, somehow the southern states have been pushed to that particular problem. One is the population divergence, and the other thing is about the fiscal policy. So I want you to share your thoughts on those two problem areas, what southern states are facing.
Sure. So, again, a wicked problem is, I don't know, I'm sure all of you sat through enough exams in your life in that, a wicked problem is what a wicked problem is, right? A problem with no easy answers and no solutions, right? Like, if we agree to the current sort of structure of our democracy and the structure of our government, these two problems are essentially unsolvable. That's why I call them wicked problems, right? Problem A, problem of resource allocation, right? The Finance Commission's allocation ratios are what I take for starters, but it is true for every other kind of resource allocation that the union government does, right? So what is the problem, right? The 14th Finance Commission started using what is 2011 census data for allocation of financial resources from the budget, right? And what is the problem there, right? Until the 14th Finance Commission, or until very recently, like 10 years ago or 15 years ago, the comport amongst various states in India was that we will use the census of 1971 for all our resource allocation problems. And why did we do this? We did this because in the mid 70s, in what is probably the most illiberal sort of document ever written in a liberal democracy, the emergency, whatever, Article 41 or whatever it is, it did a whole bunch of things. But in it, it also stuck in this thing wherein, because family planning was considered a policy of what is quote unquote national importance, it also added the fact that they would freeze the population data at 1971 for all future resource allocation problems for a period of 25 years, right? And from 25 years, the Vajpayee government extended it to this is for delimitation, but it was true for Finance Commission allocations as well, right? Until the 14th Finance Commission, it was 1971 data that was used, right? Now, in the time between 1971 and 2011, what has happened? Kerala's population grew by 56%. Rajasthan's population grew by 177%. How are you ever going to solve these resource allocation problems when you have such extraordinary divergence? Yeah, like Reverend Malthus, when he wrote the famous Malthusian trap, sort of assumed a population growth which actually is less than, and people thought that was extreme. And he wrote this when 1798, right? And people at that time thought it was absurd that he was making these assumptions. Rajasthan's population growth exceeds the Malthusian assumption in the 20th century. And the 21st century until 2011, right? When you have this extreme divergence among states, and Kerala's population, and that's true for Tamil Nadu as well, and Tamil Nadu, for instance, is going to be the first state which is going to have a decrease in population in the decade 2031 to 41, right? Now, if you have this extreme divergence in population, why did this happen? It's because Mrs. Indira Gandhi basically said, states control your population. There are these states which actually did that. And there are those states which did not do that. You essentially followed orders, and the reward that you get at the end of following orders is that your funding is cut off, your sort of political representation is cut off. Like, why would you ever then participate in this government? Like, what is a government of a self-governing thing in a democracy? It is that you want to have, we pay in taxes. We want to have just representation and just devolution of that tax money so that we can run our society in what is its best sort of, possible version of it, right? And while doing that, we want just representation in parliament. What this does is, when you start taking 2011 population, is it breaks that covenant. And that is the problem.
It's quite valid, like what you have discussed here. My next question would be, like, our Prime Minister is having this vision of 2047, like we would be a developed nation. So what kind of contribution do you think the southern states would do, like to help out in the entire vision of 2047?
If a politician ever speaks of a time that he's probably not going to be alive, don't take him seriously. That's my rule number one, right? Rule number two, these southern states are like, I don't exist in order to make your life better, or vice versa. Just like, one society does not exist to make the life of another society better. Everybody is in it for themselves. Yeah. And the unit of society, what you consider to be your unit, whether, to me, Madras is my unit. I don't even think of rest of Tamil Nadu as my unit, right? Like there may be somebody else who does that, right? In fact, maybe, my neighborhood in Madras, like South Madras is probably my unit, right? I probably have never gone to North Madras. But the point I'm trying to make is these boundaries of what we think of as the unit of our society have to be organic. If somebody sitting in Delhi says that 1.4 billion people is your unit, it is sort of, it is unimaginable. Human beings have never dealt with 1.4 billion 4 billion people being the unit of their civilization. You cannot do policy effectively. You cannot raise taxes effectively. You cannot devolve effectively. You cannot measure progress effectively. So I don't take anybody's assertion of the future being, what do you do for the nation's development? The nation or the country exists for the convenience of the states, not vice versa, right? It's a political union so that we can have sort of, economies of scale, right? Think of it as a European Union. If you say that, I or my state or your state or somebody else exists in order for the development of the country, like that's having it ass backwards.
Fine. So we have talked about the divide. We have talked about the problems. Now, you are the best person to give the solution also. So the last part of your book talks about the solution. So share.
Sure. So again, a little bit of a detour, right? So when I wrote this book, I thought my original contribution was the last third of my book, which was the actual solution, which I was actually proud of. Except the media basically picked up the first third of the book and, went to town with it saying that, oh my God, India is so divergent. I'm like, I thought everybody knew that already. Apparently they didn't. But the point is that, how do you solve this problem? Right? We have a country of 1.4 billion people. The problems of resource allocation are, seemingly impossible to solve. How do you solve this problem, right? Like, because one easy solution that, the predecessors of the DMK including the DMK until the 1964 war with 62, whenever the war with China happened, was that, they sought explicit secession. That's a terrible idea. And the reason why it's a terrible idea is that if you have the same governing structure, but draw a line somewhere saying that, instead of one country, we'll have two countries, you're going to inherit the same problem in a smaller country. It just makes no sense. Plus, you'll have a lot of violence to go with it, right? Like, it doesn't make sense. What is the democratic way to solve for this problem is the actual question. Yeah. And the solution that I propose, and I sort of look into this and I analyze the actual root of the problem, which is that if you were to look at our MPs and our parliamentary democracy, you quickly realize, and I'm not going to go into the details, I encourage you to go buy my book where I do this analysis, which is that you realize that the office of the MP is a vestige of, what is a member of parliament in the Westminster system? It sort of comes down from the Magna Carta and the English Civil War, yeah? And the monarch or the English king gave barons and lords certain concessions to set up the parliament. And if you look at the modern Indian member of parliament, you can see that it's not a vestige of that old system, but it's almost by design that they are essentially made powerless so that the monarch, and in this case, the government headed by the prime minister, whoever the prime minister may be, sort of gets their way through, right? And that is the basic problem, right? You do not have the just representation of people's will in governance, right? And how do you solve for this is the actual question. What I propose is gamified direct democracy, right? So, what's the problem here? The problem here is that, I vote in South Madras. My MP happens to be a lovely person. I really like her. Her name is Tamirzhi Thangapandian. You should see her in parliament, but she's powerless. She has the DMK decides what she can and cannot do. She cannot go and vote in parliament as I tell her to do, right? And this is true for all of you as well. Your MP is essentially useless, right? Your MP is part of a bloc that he or she belongs to in a party. Right? Now, how do you solve for this? And if the MP had any power, he or she would vote such that the constituency, their taxes, their devolution, all of this will be impacted in all of these policy decisions. But he or she is just, it's impossible for that person to vote that way because, the anti-defection law, the party whip, like the way in which our parliamentary democracy structure is entirely against it, right? So the question then becomes, how do we represent our will in governance without this transmission loss which is happening through the MP? If you go look at ancient Athens, they did solve this problem, except, it was a much smaller sort of city-state back then. But essentially, what did they do? Imagine that, the problems of scale have vanished, but these are equivalent. What did they do? They essentially assembled all property-owning free men in what is it, town square, and sort of had them vote on issues of the day. But what is the problem there? Tyranny, right? Like if you let a mob vote, what are they going to do? They're going to be like, I don't like Dr. Meena Rajesh, let's hang her, right? They did it to Socrates, right? So it's not new, right? So why do we have the modern liberal democracy? It is that it has a series of checks and balances so that this tyrannical mob can be prevented, which is why Plato called democracy, we now use democracy as a good thing. Plato used it as a pejorative. We often forget that, right? So how do we sort of... but the other point here is that particular way essentially had 100% transmission efficiency. Everybody got a vote on the issue of the day. So the question then becomes, how do you get a system where you have near perfect transmission efficiency, but yet have the guardrails of the modern liberal democracy so that you sort of arrive at this solution organically so that we don't descend into violence. Yeah. And so after, again, I encourage you to read the book, but like the proposal that I have is that, we will give everybody N votes. Yeah. And if we give everybody, and then what we do is we also divorce the calendar from the it's a little complicated to explain here, so it'll probably take half an hour of its own, but what I am going to, the crux of it is as follows. Everybody gets N votes, yeah, and you essentially bring up something and wherein you have to sort of, in order for it to be brought to vote, you first have to make it pass through a smaller sort of a voting of itself. Once it passes, it gets sort of, everybody gets to vote on it. Now, if you vote yes, and it passes, your N becomes N minus 1, right? Whereas if I vote no, and it passes, I can, my N stays N. And more importantly, if you want to vote no, you can use all your N votes. Whereas if you want to vote yes, you get to use only one vote. That is, what it achieves is that it achieves a slow-moving sort of democratic path forward where it defends the rights of the minority through this veto. Yeah. Now, what will happen if such a system existed? Consider the budget that Ms. Nirmala Sitharaman passed. If you were to look at it, there is a whole bunch of what are called central flagship programs whose total budget allocation is about 5 lakh crores. Yeah, the total money that the union government sends to states is about 1.6, 1.7 lakh crores. And all of these central flagship programs are the union government spending on what are state subjects, right? It's a pretty pathetic, idiotic idea. However, the union government does it because politicians want to do things in their name. And that's why, it's not the incumbent government's problem. It's a problem of structure, right? So, however, if we had this system, what will happen? Nobody in Tamil Nadu or Kerala is essentially going to agree with, anything on health or education that, that particular central flagship program has. Similarly, a lot of people in Bihar will disagree with a lot of things that go down to, Tamil Nadu or, Kerala or Karnataka for that matter, right? So what will happen is that the ability of the union government to do anything at this scale will be stopped. Instead, what will happen is that sort of power of spending will then flow organically downwards, again, because of the way in which the voting system works in that. And then what will happen is that it is a natural system of moving power down and down until it reaches your local government. Yeah. So how we arrive at this equilibrium, again, like I said, it's probably a little bit of a hand-wavy thing to do it in like such a short time. I encourage you to go read it, but that is the idea. So the idea is that using this idea of gamified direct democracy, we encourage citizens and we eliminate this idea of elected representatives so they have direct participation in their government through deliberative mechanism.
That's really, it's a very good idea, but it will take a long time to, with such a kind of population we have, it seems to be next to impossible. Like, we hope that one day it will be, at least in the form of a, case-led or a case study could be introduced in any part of India.
I must say, I tried it at my Residents Welfare Association. None of the uncles wanted it. So.
Okay.
Thank you so much,
thank
Nilakantan sir and Meena Rajesh ma'am, for this wonderful session. Thank you, audience, for joining us.